we have any hashtags for this? I should ask that too.
Free the land. Well, I guess free the land is kind of taken.
Well, Black August Resistance, free the land. Yeah.
Yeah, let me retweet this Robeson House.
Yeah. That's what I'm doing too.
All right, I got the link for y'all too.
Okay.
Perfect.
There it is. It's in the chat. And let's drop this music.
DJ drop.
Like an Oprah thing. I don't know why I was doing an Oprah voice for that.
Thanks for coming out to this meet. All respects to, let's be seated. We've been stressed, it's been getting heat. Escalated murders, increased beats. Some of you wanna roll your eyes at this, but you won't when they swole up in them bandages. This an agenda for advantages. Gutter for the fall of the alley pins. Calling arms like Ongbak, elbows and knees, we taking headshots. Between a heart and a stone rock, gorillas in the fields killing mascots. Criminals to revolutionaries, wearing all black before the cemetery. Cap bleeding in a crunch like red berries. Tell them burn my body, don't let them bury. I was the one in the mess hall, not wearing clothes to the protocol. Never adjusted to the cattle call. Nigga had a couple visits, made a couple calls. No matter what they did, I wouldn't quit. Now we got a like-minded mosh pit. We got an army full of tactics, and the strikers already like a matchup. Whoa, I'ma tell you right now, not trying to make a rider from a nigga who just won't ride, or relying on a nigga who's half committed, part law when his lives on the line. It's on you to decide, but choosing nothing is the same thing as choosing sides. But I can only die once, and there's a bounty for the crimes we alive, organized, let's march. Nigga, when you can't take no more. Nigga, tapping on a cell block wall. Nigga, tell you relax and face the facts, bullet in your back, now you're gone, that's march. Say one thing, do another, that's march. Nigga, they be lying, that's march. Cover up, march. Got to be strong when a motherfucker trying to show you goosebumps. How many follow, took and swallow, pick the model, brains is hollow. How many took the plea, regrets? James Brown on the one to life sentence. How many did the crime, paid your tithes, still locked down and wondering why? How many doing time for crimes against you? Now let me see you put your hands high. We gotta keep up with the stamina, cause they can't wait to call in the examiner. COs and nurses try our advocate. No views, no world star cameras. Don't be impatient cause they testing niggas. MK Ultra, setting niggas. Don't let them give you dopamine, back kitchen, cook vaccine, and men in black beans, no. Cage deep like fornication. Red hot chili Californication. Wings clipped by the overseer. Niggas won't fly pelican in isolation. It's a lot of shit they won't face while they putting nightsticks in a dark place. Can you imagine that it came to this? Hell yeah, cause we knew how long it exists. Black August resistance, you know the call. That means march, nigga, march, march. Get your reps in on the yard, meditating on the energy they wanna start. Pass the word, mind the guards, both sides of the wall, we ain't never gonna fall. Power from chaos, we got the like seance. Finna ring alarms in this bitch like. So tell them get the books check. Tell them we got rookies in the bets check. Tell them we got women and the men. We ain't trying to make amends. We just gonna slam dance guitars. Strategic and we militant. Wu-Tang chefs at the grilling pit. Using us as target practice. Karma snatching. Orangutans boomerang quick. Everybody got a silence. Looked each other in the eye and acknowledged us. Black, brown, yellow, red politics. Homies on the block, honeys on the strip. 1,000 fleas on the lines lit. Can't touch us all cause we too legit. Too much pride, too much lineage. Ambitions of a rider, we too lit, nigga. I'ma tell you again, not trying to make a rider from a nigga who just won't ride. Or relying on a nigga who's half committed, part law when his lives on the line. It's on you to decide, but choosing nothing is the same thing as choosing sides. But I could only die once and there's a bounty for the crimes we alive, organized like march. Nigga, when you can't take no more. Nigga, tapping on a cell block wall. Nigga, tell you relax and face the facts, bullet in your back, now you're gone, that's march. Say one thing, do another, that's march. Nigga, they be lying, that's march. Cover up, march. Got to be strong when a motherfucker tryna show you goosebumps. Marching for stolen lives and red rum. Looking in focus while the pets come. They gon' come with all they got, but we ain't gon' stop. We universal on a chop chop. Get your fasting in and get right. Collect your click and get your thug life. You them carry on in the fight. We already paid the price.
If they take me in the morning, they're coming for you at night.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. Oh man, we've been waiting for this day for a long time. So happy that the day is finally here. We've been, planning before it was even a quarantine, doing this at Hakim's bookstore. So shout out to Hakim's as well, and the team over there. So excited that we're finally here. Hi everybody, my name is Chris Rogers. I take he, him pronouns. I'm the program director at the Paul Robeson House and Museum. And welcome to, Free the Land, a special Black August Forum. It is we got a double play day today at the Robeson House. This is our first event of the day, and at 3:30 we'll be having another live stream event with Kulu Mele and African dance. And this event is really exciting. It's going to be really interactive. I thank Dr. Onaci for how much amazing content he's contributed to over this month around the book. I wanted really to emphasize the forum aspect of this conversation. So I'm happy to bring people in conversation, including Elias and also Rodrigues, who's experiencing technical difficulties right now, but we hope to have on before the end of the call. So with that being said, I want to stick. We got a script for this thing, right? We wrote some things up. So I want to read that to open us up for the day, get a little bit into the bios, and then we can kind of go from there. So, Free the Land, published by UNC Press, authored by Dr. Onaci, is the first book to tell the full history of the RNA and the new Afrikan Independence Movement. Edward Onaci shows how new Africans remade their lifestyles and daily activities to create a self-consciously revolutionary culture, and argues that the RNA's tactics and ideology were essential to the evolution of Black political struggles. Onaci expands the story of Black power politics, shedding new light on the long-term legacies of mid-century Black nationalism. In today's moment of radical possibility, this conversation is meant to uplift the power and radical vision that emerges from studying Black movements for change. And really, our conversation will explore many of the themes of the prospects and practices necessary for building lasting formations for revolutionary change. And to give you, we have some amazing bios that were, I want to, introduce our guests properly. So I guess I should begin with myself, right? Christopher R. Rogers, the Public Programs Director at the Paul Robeson House and Museum, and organizes with Black Lives Matter at School. We just launched a Year of Purpose last night. You can learn more about that, blacklivesmatteratschool.com. And I also serve on the board of the Philadelphia Student Union, who's currently engaged in a campaign, student-led campaign in Philadelphia for police-free schools, right? And I think that has a lot to do when we talk about like community control, when we talk about, resistance as well. Also, let's move to Dr. Edward Onaci is the author of Free the Land, The Republic of New Africa and the Pursuit of a Black Nation State, published through UNC Press in 2020, and teaches courses on African American history, modern US history, women's global political struggles, social movements of music in Africa and its diaspora, and more at Ursinus College. They incorporate interdisciplinary scholarship and emphasize student empowerment. Dr. Onaci's instruction also makes use of creative resources and high impact tools such as Reacting to the Past and Digital Liberal Arts Project. His approach encourages students to take ownership over their personal and group studies, produce their own knowledge, and apply what they have learned in class to their current lives and future ambitions. The book, Free the Land, is still 40% off with the promo code. I'll post this into the YouTube as we get started, and post that link where you can sort of get a copy of that. Additionally, we have Elias Rodrigues on the call. Elias Rodrigues is a PhD candidate at the University of Pennsylvania. His work has been published in N+1, Book Forum, and elsewhere. He reviewed Free the Land for the Baffler under the title of Another Country. And I'll be posting that link as well so you can read more of his analysis and response to the book. And I know he didn't want to put this in there, but I know he's also working on a novel project. Maybe he'll talk about that at some point. And I also want to lift up Rodrigues. Rodrigues Selby Adebisi is a native of Philadelphia, co-founder of the Philadelphia chapter of the Malcolm X grassroots movement and a member of the New African People's Organization. She connected to the New African Independence Movement while a student of African American Studies at Temple University. In 2011, Darayja co-authored the text, What Sisters Want, What Sisters Believe, Black Feminist 12-Point Plan, which was published in the book, Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around, 40 Years of Movement Building with Barbara Smith. Shout out to Barbara Smith as well. She has organized around political prisoners, Black land and farming, and education disparities. She currently works as an educator in North Philadelphia. So we have a wonderful, being that it is, still Black August, and there's an amazing sort of arts and cultural concert that's happening tomorrow that we'll be sure to, continue to plug throughout this session. Darayja offered her words to give us a little bit of background and history of Black August. And I want to also, read this, and then I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Onaci for maybe, additional comments, but also to launch us into this forum. So Darayja offers, Black August is a tradition of resistance and remembrance of fallen freedom fighters, particularly of those who were killed by the US government in the 1970s. Interestingly, some of the people we remember during Black August, in the process of developing Black August as an annual tradition at the time of their deaths. One of the most known freedom fighters that we commemorate during Black August is Comrade George Jackson, who was murdered while in prison at San Quentin Prison on August 21st, 1971. Some of the comrades who are honored and remembered during Black August include Jonathan Jackson, W.L. Nolan, James McLean, William Christmas, and Katari Golden. So to give a deeper story about many of these comrades, Jonathan Jackson, who was gunned down outside the Marin County, California courthouse on August 7th, 1970, as he attempted to liberate 3 imprisoned Black liberation fighters, 2 of which were James McLean and William Christmas. On January 13th, 1970, W.L. Nolan was assassinated when he was shot to death by prison guards on the yard in California's Soledad State Prison. Katari Golden was murdered by San Quentin prison guards August 1st, 1978. Katari was one of the key intellectual architects of the Black August commemorative tradition and was a prominent leader of the Black guerrilla family, BGF, after Comrade George was assassinated. Katari was a leading force in the formation of Black August, particularly its historical and ideological foundations. Katari, like many of the unnamed freedom fighters of the BGF and the revolutionary prison movement of the 1970s, was murdered. He was assassinated by the government, who denied him medical treatment following a mysterious accident on the San Quentin prison yard, and was murdered to eliminate his leadership and destroy the growing prison resistance movement. And we know that was not finished, and that prison resistance is still bountiful and abundant today. After Katari's transition, to honor him and to honor these fallen soldiers and the revolutionary vision and principles they embody, brothers throughout the prisons of California united together to continue their revolutionary work. Many of them shaved their heads. They wore Black armbands, and in unity with the Black Muslim prisoners during Ramadan, fasted from sunrise to sunset. In August 1979, the first official Black August resistance took place. The brothers and political family members who participated in the collective founding of Black August wore Black armbands on their left arm and studied revolutionary works, particularly those of Comrade George Jackson. During the month of August, the brothers did not listen to the radio or watch television. Additionally, they didn't eat or drink anything from sunup to sundown, and loud and boastful behavior was not allowed. The use of drugs and alcoholic beverages was prohibited, and the brothers held daily exercises to sharpen their minds, bodies, and spirits, and honor the collective principles of self-sacrifice, inner fortitude, and revolutionary discipline needed to advance the new African struggle for self-determination and freedom. Black August, therefore, became a commemorative time for us to embrace the principles of communion, unity, self-sacrifice, political education, physical training, and determined resistance. A select few community members joined in solidarity. So the 4 components of Black August, of a Black August celebration. Fasting. Many people who practice this component of Black August practice a sunrise to sunset fast, or a 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. fast. For those who have health conditions that may prevent them from doing a complete fast, they opt to give up something for the month of August, like coffee, alcohol, or sweets. Study. Many people use the month of Black August to have study groups around revolutionary texts, or that have conversations around books and texts relevant to our movement, like the conversation we're having today. And for our YouTube community, continue to like name and put those revolutionary texts into the chat and let folks know what you're studying and also, what should be studied. To train. During Black August, those who commemorate also use this time to physically train. The Malcolm X grassroots movement has been having weekly virtual family fitness and defense sessions on Saturdays. And to fight. During Black August, revolutionaries recommit themselves for fighting for Black liberation and continue to resist the oppression and repression of our people. So thank you, Darasia, for this amazing history and understanding of Black August resistance. And I want to pass it to Dr. Onaci to maybe, give any additional comments you may have, and also to get us started with our forum. So thank you.
Thank you. Greetings, everyone. Free the land, Black August resistance, all power to all the people. I'm really, really excited to be here. And just to quickly add on to what Chris presented on behalf of Darasia, I would just say that, yeah, Black August resistance is a perfect time to really study the ideas that the people, the revolutionaries who came before us put out there, and that help us continue to build movements for self-determination, for political power, and whatever else we need, for full human rights of all people, right? The destruction of oppression. I would, in my opinion, Black August resistance is a great springboard to regular study and regular conversation about these themes, especially in this time that we're living in right now, where we're seeing the contradictions of oppression. They're being exposed, and they're being presented to us very plainly in ways that they haven't been in quite some time. So hopefully, especially for those of you who are being introduced to these concepts for the first time, hopefully this becomes a springboard for some regular study, regular discussion. The three of us, and hopefully when Sister Darasia joins us, we'll all put our social media handles so that folks can reach out to us. We'd love to continue this conversation. But having said that, again, I appreciate the space that we have here today. Thanks so much to the Paul Robeson House for creating it. Thank you, Chris, for bringing us all together to have this conversation. Elias, I really appreciate the review that you did and the analysis that you put forth. I'm really honored that you all see this book that I had the opportunity to write as an important springboard for discussion. So in light of that, I'd like to offer a bit of introduction to anyone who's not yet familiar with this new African independence movement or the history that I've written about. And it all begins in the final weekend of March 1968, when 500 well-respected Black political leaders from all over the country went to Detroit, Michigan to determine the direction of the Black liberation movement and the captive Black nation. During their convention, the folks who had gathered decided that it was important for African descended people in the US to struggle for political independence and territorial sovereignty. They agreed that the geographic focus of the movement would be 5 states in the Deep South: Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, and Georgia, right over my shoulder over there. They also dedicated themselves to the pursuit of monetary reparations, the protection of Black political prisoners and prisoners of war, as outlined in international law, and the destruction of global white supremacy, US imperialism, and violently imposed capitalism. The convention goers called the captive Black nation in the US and the territory that they hope to claim the Republic of New Africa. And so there are, in my assessment, many important lessons that we can take from this history, but I just want to really focus on one for now, and that is really based on the timing of the convention that founded this movement. According to the histories that I was exposed to for most of my life, the civil rights struggles that led to the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, right? We're actually kind of celebrating some of that right now with the commemoration of the 1963 March on Washington, right? In many of the histories, these became the end all and the be all of Black struggle. And even when that wasn't the end all be all, when I was personally able to learn about Black power and revolutionary Black nationalism, the texts that I came across tended to de-emphasize any analysis of the tendencies that sought political and territorial independence. To be clear, what was presented was very important, right? Continues to be very important. We need to know this history in its totality. The ideas and the people, they demonstrate very important milestones and reflect unceasing struggle that many of the most recognizable leaders in our history were carrying forward. However, again, especially as presented, it seemed as if these folks weren't trying to solve systemic problems, right? They were trying to get in, expand the boundaries of what American citizenship meant and things like that. And so the call for this Black Government Convention in 1968 served as an overwhelming critique of the widespread belief that Black people could achieve true liberation and political power within the US empire. They were pretty clear that the new African independence movement for self-determination, as manifest through independent statehood and the destruction of oppression wherever it exists, to paraphrase the declaration that they put forth, provided any chance for meaningful change. And so just to quickly sum up, because I don't want to talk too much, right? This is really about a discussion between the various panelists, but just to quickly sum up, I think that this history and hopefully the way that I presented it in this book really puts the question of self-determination on the table. Not self-determination in hyper-individualistic terms, even though how individuals exercise it and put it into practice is important, but self-determination in terms of what does it mean to be a nation? How can captive nations use the concept of self-determination to pursue independence and political power on their own terms? And so, having said that, again, the goal of this conversation is to centralize the collective knowledge and analysis that everyone on this panel represents. And so in the spirit of that collective expertise, I'm curious to hear from my co-panelists, how do you define self-determination? And how does the history of the new African independence movement help you develop your own ideas about that concept?
Chris, do you want to go first?
Oh man, we gotta get you talking too, but I'll go first. Thank you for the question. I'm still very early within my own study of the new African independence movement. But I think a huge moment for my own organizing and activism is that shift that you already mentioned around shifting from the fight or pursuit of recognition within a sort of like colonial, like a colonial framework, or trying to, as you know, 1619 Project might say, like perfect the democracy of America towards really like thinking of an elsewhere, or thinking of building our own institutions, our own spaces, our own ways of forming community control. I think in this moment, it's very apparent in terms of like our response to police terrorism, and seeing the ways that I don't know if you would even call these folks revolutionaries, that are more sort of along the lines of calling towards like we want a nicer police system. We want no chokehold policy, like those type of things. I don't even know if you consider those to be anybody that we need to even be considered part of the conversation that we're going for. But I think the crucial turn in terms of like how we govern our communities, right? And how we build our own ways of creating and maintaining safety in our spaces, particularly in West Philadelphia, where the Robeson House is, and Malcolm X Park it has become a forum to like think about what does it mean to really really sit in that idea of community control and think about institution building. And the Robeson House has been a space that has been around since 1994, and we've been thinking of like, how do we serve as a space of like education, but also how do we, you know, as this event is doing, serve as a forum to bring people together around these ideas and say like, in many ways, we have the knowledge, we have the wisdom, we have the resources to be able to create the mechanisms that our communities need, rather than, you know, continuing to like look out or ask elected officials or to ask of, you know, representatives of this sort of like colonial system to do for us. So I've been thinking about that turn within my own work, within the way that we seek to hold the Robeson House. And also, I think at some point, also think about it in education. This is another space that I've been deeply involved in, also with the schools, right? And thinking about like community control of schools and what does that mean? But I'll save that for another part of the conversation, because I think that education part is also a space in which we have to really think about how do we, you know, claim our own ideas and ancestry and lineages and legacies, rather than sort of like fighting to create a multicultural curriculum or whatever that means. So I'll stop there, and you know, I would love to hear from Elias.
Yeah, I should say thanks, Chris, for having me. Thanks, Ed, for writing this book. Yeah, super provocative, and I'm really grateful to be here. I don't want to dunk on police reformists too much because it's kind of a waste of time, but I got to say the like, you have to tell me before you shoot me shit always gets me, you know? It's like, oh, thank goodness you warned me. I mean, still got a bullet hole in my stomach, but like, at least I knew it was coming, you know? But on the tip of self-determination, for me, I'll talk a little bit more about the new African independence movement stuff since I've read the book and I've been thinking about this stuff a lot, you know, and one of the ways that it had made me think about it was that self-determination is both a sort of active, everyday practice that is also aspirational. So what do I mean by that? So, you know, in '68, right, there's the we are no longer citizens of the United States of America, right? A group of people in the new African independence movement are just like, we're no longer citizens. One way that one might imagine going from there is sort of waiting for recognition, waiting for one's other citizenship to be recognized by the US government, the UN, other such places. And that, you know, all that work, as Ed points out, happens, you know, people, you know, go to the Secretary of State and are like, give us land, you know, the petitions are filed, etc. And that all makes sense. But at the same time, also, yeah, people just started building, you know, they bought land in the South. They were just like, let's build our own schools, you know, let's develop our own curriculums. We're going to have our own elections. We're going to educate voters about elections. We're going to develop our own defense force, and we're going to train people in how to use firearms, right? So this is part of the like, yeah, self-determination did seem to be, let's say maybe especially between like, I don't know, '68 and '84 for the new African independence movement. Did seem to be a very practical, everyday practice, right? And, you know, as Ed points out also that this really comes down to lifestyle choices as well. Name changes, right? If a last name is a slave name, then changing one's name to have a different way of calling oneself, being a different sort of way of determining who one is politically, but also personally. Those things are, of course, imbricated, related, but not always exactly the same thing. At the same time, it also seems to be quite aspirational. I mean, yes, the new African independence movement was doing all of these things, and at the same time, they were being hounded by the FBI, by the US government, right? So it's like, to me, it seems really important to take seriously that they were acting as though they had a country, to be like, actually, they did have a country. You know, it just so happens to be the case that the sovereignty of that country, the self-determination of that country was perpetually undermined by the US government, be it through refusing to recognize in the sort of more passive aggressive function, or by actively just sending, you know, police officers and FBI agents to raid people's home in the more active function, incarcerating people. And I think this is not actually, this shouldn't be that surprising in a way to think about self-determination in this way, because this is true of so many currently sovereign nations, nations whose sovereignty are recognized by other nations that are post-colonial, right? I mean, throughout the Caribbean, there are all sorts of countries that are technically sovereign, whose sovereignty is constantly being undermined, let's say, by US governmental forces, multinational corporations, right? So to me, it seems like self-determination is both aspirational and is also practical and everyday. So by aspirational, I mean that it's people are having a country, but at the same time, other people are actively trying to undermine that country. But I don't know, Ed, I'd be curious to hear what you think about all those things.
Well, thank you for that. I really appreciate your framing, as it's both aspirational, but it's also something that people can just do, right? And I really think that that gets at one of the central concepts in the book, which is lifestyle politics, which for folks who haven't read it yet is a term that I learned from a scholar named W. Lance Bennett. He uses it differently than I do, but I use it in order to hopefully help get at what Elias is saying, which is, as people are participating in collective struggle for self-determination, their lifestyles, they actively cater their lifestyles to support that collective action. And when thinking about self-determination, that's one of the way, so this, hopefully this comes out right. That's one of the most exciting parts to me, right? And I'm saying I hope that comes out right, because I don't want to romanticize anything. I don't want to make it seem as though this isn't serious struggle, but it makes even aspirational goals seem more achievable to me, right? And so, okay, if I'm thinking about something that other people would consider to be a lofty goal, such as, wait for it, the ability to govern myself, as Chris said, to come up with my own schools, to, you know, not just me, of course, we, to create the forces that keep us safe and address violations of community sovereignty and safety from within and without, right? Then the way that I live my life, if the way that I live my life can help us get to that place, that's actually really doable. It's actually really, really doable. And so that's one of the things that's been on my mind quite a bit because of all of the uprisings all over the country. How are people have these ideas? Some of these ideas are in conflict. Some of them work really well together. But no matter what, how do people try to actualize the ideas in their daily lives? How are they living? How are we living? Does how I live match up with what I say is important politically, spiritually, economically, etc.? So that's where I am in terms of self-determination on this day, on this afternoon. I do just want to say real quick in response, when during that Black government convention, the folks who convened, and more particularly, there were over 100 people who got together and signed what they called a Declaration of Independence. And some of the wording is, we hereby declare ourselves forever free and independent, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, we're dealing with human rights lawyers and people who understood international and US law. And so they were careful about the framing. They argued not that, you know, the people who got together all of a sudden just were like, you know, we're not US citizens. Instead, what they did was they problematized the 14th Amendment. And they argued that the citizenship that African descended people were living in the United States of America was a result of force. It was the result of recapturing a previously captive but very temporarily free nation, right? And just to make that hopefully a little more concrete, they argued that enslaved Africans and people who were not considered to be enslaved were captives of the United States of America. And with the 13th Amendment, that captive nation became a liberated or a free nation, not liberated, but a free nation. They did liberate themselves, but anyway. And at that point, there should have been a time when the people of that previously captive nation could get together and could determine their fate on their own terms without outside interference. And they argued that instead of having that space, instead of having that time, with the 14th Amendment, citizenship was imposed on the Black nation and it pretty much recaptured them, right? And so one of the stories that I tell to really help illustrate that is one of the co-founders, Baba Gaidi Obadeli. He was a lawyer in Detroit, and it's kind of, you know, I see it as kind of a comical story, especially the way it's told in the newspapers, but he's arguing a case in court and the judge stops him and says, "Hey, I thought you weren't a citizen. That means you have no right to practice law in the state of Michigan. You got to go." Right? And Baba Gaidi, he responds and says, "He can't do that to me. Regardless of what I may think, that's not what the law of the land says." And that's what's really important there. That's the law of the land says that Black people are citizens of this country by birthright, by migrating and pursuing citizenship through legal channels, et cetera, et cetera. But because that was forced upon people, and because even what was forced upon people has not even lived up to what the words of the 14th Amendment say, which is supposed to guarantee protection under the law, then what was actually in place was akin to what they call paper citizenship, right? It's there on paper, it's there in the law, but there's no actual practice by the state that supports that that's what we truly experience and live. And so having said that, I've used that to tell a couple of stories because I like some of the stories in the book, and yes, I'm biased. But I'm just wondering for you two, are there any specific concepts, events, or stories that you find particularly important that really help you learn something that you can then take and put into practice? If so, what is it? And I have a couple follow-up questions, but we can just begin there.
Yeah, I should say also really quickly, I was being a little fast and loose in my history of what happened to sort of get to the point about self-determination. And I appreciate that story, as well as the point that they were human rights lawyers. You know, I mean, I think this is actually it so clearly illustrates that problem of self-determination, right? It's that, like, because you know that you have to achieve your means in the world that you currently live in, there are certain ways in which what you aspire towards, which is self-determination, is still sort of being impinged upon or affected by, at the very least, by the world that you currently live in, by the state that is currently claiming you as a citizen, even if a paper citizen, a half citizen, a non-citizen. I do think that there were quite a few stories in the book that were really, really meaningful to me. And I must say, this is going to be quite a boring one, but you know, I think it was the story, I believe this was Marilyn Killingham, whose grandmother had been enslaved, was it?
Great grandmother, yeah.
Yeah, whose great grandmother had been enslaved, and who grew up hearing about the stories of slavery, the experience, and also was sort of carrying forward the knowledge of resistance, as well as the knowledge of the oppression that came from that time, from her great grandmother to the present, and you know, more recently, you know. That story, I think, strikes me as particularly important in a way because it feels, well, here are a couple of thoughts. Here are just a couple of thoughts. One, I think that there are a lot of people who are trying to find a way to explain what sort of linkages there are between resistance under slavery and resistance that happened in the 20th century and resistance today. That story strikes me as quite important because there's actually just a very clear memory here. You know, the great-grandmother was alive and was telling stories and passing down those stories. It's a really helpful reminder, particularly for those of us who grew up in a time in which no one was alive who had been enslaved in America, at least not under the sort of form of chattel slavery pre-1863. For those of us who grew up after the last of those people had died, it can actually be quite hard to remember the ways in which that knowledge has come down to us, just quite practically and materially. And it's a helpful way to remember, I think, the ways that Black radicalism continued from the past to the present. Like, it's not just a sort of like magical spirit or just people reading, but sometimes it was actually just oral history. It just was a thing that people passed down to their children. So of course, is quite important to me as someone who's learned quite a bit about my own family and my own family history from my mother, who learned it from her mother, and so on, I think. I think on the other hand, it also really helps us think about more generally the sort of very political dimensions of Black kinship. You know, what it means that the person who is raising you is also telling you about a form of slavery that you did not have to experience, but that would come to shape the way that you resisted for the rest of your life. That sort of Black families, even as you were sort of being raised from a pretty young age, are kind of always political spaces, are politicized. Those are just two thoughts. I'm sure I'll have others. Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm thinking you got me going around the Black family. I'm gonna sit with that some more. But my immediate connection was around like lifestyle politics, and I think being it's so like I'll need to read it just so I can like say it to myself. Lifestyle politics are the constant interpretation, contestation, negotiation, and reproduction of activist shared ideas within both civic arenas and domains deemed personal and or private. And when I think about our spaces, what I love about the history of the organization and the ways that they struggle and adapt the struggle and evolve the struggle over the years is the role of the organization and being a glue and laying the groundwork for like principled struggle around these ideas. And I think one of the things that I'm noticing today, in a way that we are really attempting to like embrace decentralization of struggle and that like leaderful movements, and that there's many different formations, and those different formations have different tendencies and strategies. But also the role of how the line between the personal and the private and the arenas in which we struggle over ideas, and how that comes back into, you know, developing out like movement vehicles. So, I mean, I guess I'm subtweeting right now to say like a lot of the discourse that we see online, right? That is attempting to, you know, form a line of like, you know, liberation strategies. But it's not necessarily held in organization, and it gets really messy, and we have to figure out like, how do we hold ourselves together within this mix, and recognizing that like in many ways we are, you know, as many of the members that are in the book, you start in one place and you end up in another, and you go through many different formations and then different groups that you're working with, sometimes simultaneously. But really thinking of the role of organization, and whether, and I see some people might say like, for the long haul of this work, we all need to be involved. We all need to be involved in the org. We got to get committed to something, right? And use that place and struggle through that place to really build out movements. Where I think there's another school of thought that is saying, maybe there's something about organization that is like limiting the possibility for like increased sort of like protagonism or increase sort of leadership or moving forward. So I think, and what lifestyle politics, the question of lifestyle politics does for me is like, I'm trying to think through and how I go about my own activism and how we might advocate, right? Is the role of sort of like that internal and personal work of transformation, how that is sometimes facilitated by these collective spaces, but also how we don't like beholden ourselves to think that these collective spaces are the full matter of the work. So I don't like, that's the issue that I feel is like critical right now. I think, particularly like this summer, with a heightened sense of organizing, a lot of people who are getting involved and thinking about the long-term sense of this work around what does it mean to like work for the long haul? What does it mean to be committed to an organization? What does it mean to like engage in principled struggle? And like how that doesn't like, it's all over the place in terms of whether it's personal, private, public, the civic arena, discourse, like it's everywhere. And trying to think of like how we engage in that in a principle. I know that was probably like a whole lot. I feel like I've maybe started ranting, but I don't know. But that's the concept that I've been sitting with, and it's kind of in this moment, right, with so much going on, to have a space for principled struggle is important, but not to let that limit our radical imagination.
Chris, who are you subtweeting?
a lot, man. I feel like there's a lot of people, like there's a lot of talk right now, right? And I think sometimes that can be left under the framework of like, this is my lifestyle, like this is me working through it. But you're like, get involved with something, man. Like, don't just be out here doing statuses and doing like your little published writing or whatever. Get committed to something. Like, so, but I'm also saying that about myself too, right? I like pointing out, but also looking at me and saying like, we have to be willing to struggle with one another, and the role of that struggle in sharpening ourselves, but also, forwarding the movement.
What is this space for both of you? What is this space to engage in this ideological struggle, this sharpening? What does it look like when simultaneously these attempts to get either reform or sometimes something that's a little more radical than reform are heavily repressed?
Good question. I mean, yeah, that's a good question. I'll say, at least, on the side, so also I organize with the Philadelphia Community Bail Fund. And on the real, it's like, yeah, it's tough sometimes, because sometimes you have that moment where you're like, should I be talking about this thing in front of my phone, which may or may not be bugged, may or may not have somebody listening in on the other side. Or on the flip side, just working specifically with and for folks who are repressed, right? People who are incarcerated. You know what I mean? I mean, obviously, in the case of protest bail, then you can think about this as something like, people who are radical, who are out there protesting, being repressed. And, we've posted protest bails. But also, I think, just in general, incarceration is political, So it is, I mean, I think it is always, I don't know, it's tough. I mean, on the real, it's just, at the least, all I can really say is that it's tough. And there's a lot of grieving right now, I mean,
yeah.
COVID is sort of like sweeping through jails. It's obviously jails are always a public health crisis, but they're especially bad currently. It's summertime, right? So it's like at the same time that it's Black August, it's like, yes, people get shot more in the summer every summer, and overdoses go up in the summer, and, gun violence, overdose, the sorts of things that, these are just issues that only touch certain communities, really. You know what I mean? It's like, sure, yeah, anything could happen to anyone, but some of us know more people who have died to these things than others. And those things have to do with race, and they have to do with money a lot of the time. So it's all
if I
hard.
may,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
oh, I was just gonna say, if I may, just I'm glad that you brought that up because that's actually something that I think we need to, and I have been seeing, right, personally in every conversation. We talk about structures of oppression, we talk about structural violence, police brutality, all these things, but then we also talk about what you're saying, right? Shootings have gone up, COVID is killing people, and I've been thinking a lot about this lately. You know, we tend to emphasize what we see in the streets, but what's happening in people's homes, right? What type and is this spike in visible violence only a tiny portion of a general increase in harm that's being done within our communities? Or is it the only harm? And I tend to lean toward it's only one aspect, and that's just the aspect that we see and we tend to focus on. But what does that then, getting back to Chris, and I'm not expecting the answers from either of you as much as I'm just raising this question because it has been raised in different spaces for much different purposes. But what is the responsibility of people who are organizing to also take on these issues in as much as they are able, right? And what does, as we think about self-determination, what types of institutions do we need to build that really help address these structural issues and these interpersonal forms of violence that ravage our communities? And again, I'm not looking for an answer as much as I'm just kind of thinking out loud and raising it, trying to frame it in a way that is much different from what I heard from the RNC and the DNC.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would love to also hear from you, Chris.
One more question in there also, because I would just love to know also just about like, yeah, what does grieving and what does healing look like? Thinking about Black August both as a time of like remembering some liberation fighters who have passed, you know, in particular, but also just in this, yeah, I mean, in the last day, people are very publicly grieving some people, Chadwick Boseman, Randall Keenan, Clifford Johnson, you know, and of course, 170,000 gone since, you know, March with COVID. So what does grieving look like, mourning, healing? Sorry, Chris, go ahead.
No, and just to like connect, the first thing that comes in mind for me, and I think it's even more heightened now. You know, everything we do sort of like now is like we got, you know, like the secure message channel. You might hop on a Zoom with some folks, but nothing. And in terms of, and we can talk about the digital divide, right? In terms of like who has access to those types of spaces and that type of like discourse. But to me, it's even throughout this moment, particularly in Philadelphia, is realizing that like the power of like physical place. And I think Malcolm X Park, which is located at 52nd and Pine, the Philadelphia Student Union office is right there at 52nd and Larchwood. It has become a really a home, right, for Black struggle in this period, and using a lot of different avenues of engagement and ways of coming together. So like while there it was an amazing, you know, platform to like lift up you know, political prisoners and remember their names and their struggles and encourage folks to like write and continue to contribute. Folks like Russell Maroon Schultz, Mumia Abu-Jamal, Mutulu Shakur, having events that are doing that work, and at the same time also having like folks like Spirits Up who are doing like yoga and meditation and more like somatic work in the park as well. But that importance of having a space, right, where folks can kind of come to, and to say that Malcolm X Park, the reason why it's named Malcolm X Park is an outcome of community struggle from generations before us, right? So it's this way in which, like, for me, the yearning for that physical space, and that and it's almost like an old Harlem thing of like, this is the square, right? That we all need to come back to and hear the different perspectives and stand with one another. I think that really, it really does something, right? In terms of engagement, that these online things, which are more available to, you know, a different kind of surveillance, right? In terms of like data pulling and all the other stuff, you know, with Malcolm X Park and 52nd Street in general, there was a time, was it just last month they had like in June, National Guard people and police are like around the outside, but still there was a way in which the people who held the space of the park created a space of like safety that had like a openness to it that allowed more people to come in. It was also a space of mutual aid. So I looked at like I think of like in particular, like BLM Philly threw an amazing Juneteenth celebration. We called it Jaunteenth. You know what I mean, put some Philly twang on it. And that energy that was felt there, it was multi-generational, was lifted up, not only like, was not just a matter of being, you know, solidly against police terrorism, but lifting up all the other spaces and needs of our communities, and doing that in an intersectional way, thinking about queer and trans, gender nonconforming experiences as well. And thinking like, okay, this is a space, and through us figuring out how to hold this space and care for this space collectively, really, you know, sets a foundation for our continued struggle. So I guess I'm answering it, I'm responding in a way to say like, I've recognized in this period of like COVID, where there's a lot of things where we're doing digital, the sort of like continued need and presence of physical place, right? And to be able to name it. And like, I think, yes, there are like real like borders to like those spaces of like, there's some people we don't want to fucking be there. And that's important. But also that feeling that you get from being in physical like closeness and proximity with one another allows for a floor to really generate some really important and powerful things. So I don't know, let me just stop there and just say like, that's what I've been sitting with, the need of like claiming physical place, right? And not just ceding the ground to say, are we gonna move online? Are we gonna have this signal chat? Are we gonna do this? But like, nah, like, let's get used to claiming like physical space, and let's get used to like building on that, right? And naming where we are, so that our people know where we are, right? So that we, in some ways, we can know who is us, right? And know who is them. Okay, I'll stop there.
That's really important. That's really important. One of the things that I learned through doing this research was, how did people do their own intelligence work? And one of the key factors is you have to get to know people. And as convenient for some of us as it is to be able to be on Zoom, right? I didn't have to travel to Philly today to be at the Paul Robeson house, even though I would love to, right? But I didn't have to, so it saved me some time. As convenient as that is, not being able to sit there next to people and have the conversation changes the dynamic. And it removes, or it creates a barrier between people that is a little bit more difficult to overcome than if we're in person, actually feeling each other's energy, actually seeing body language and things of that nature. And so, yeah, that's essential to security. It's essential to doing good intelligence that helps people protect themselves and protect their loved ones. Not that it's foolproof, not that any of it is, but it does help. So I appreciate that emphasis on physical space. I'm looking at the time, and I know that we have a limited time. I do have one more question. Perhaps we can get quick responses, because then I know that, Chris, you're monitoring the YouTube chat and you want to raise some questions from there, which we welcome. I guess just as a bit of a transition, hopefully a transitional question. Yesterday, I know that many people watched the Black National Convention proceedings. I was able to catch the first good portion of it, enough to get some of the framing. And one of the things that I noticed about the framing was that there's an emphasis on electoral justice as a tactic for Black liberation. And so I'm just wondering, again, please briefly, if you can, what do you see as the role of electoral participation in the larger movement, and what outcomes do you hope to see?
suppose I should go since Chris talked most recently. I do want to flag at some point, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about, the new African independence movement and prison organizing and inside-outside organizing, right? Like what it means to try to build physical space. And some people are on the inside, you know what I mean? Because the NIM it was an inside-outside organizing group as well, So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about that. Frankly, I got to say about voting, I cannot be convinced to care. It's like, this is really boring, but I'm just sort of like, I hear the arguments for voting as harm reduction. I hear the arguments for voting as a thing that's really important. I hear the arguments from, Black anarchists who are like, fuck voting, and these are all kind of fine, and in some ways, I don't know. I mean, sometimes part of what I think is actually, if not beautiful, at least interesting about voting is that it's like, ultimately, it actually doesn't really matter in some ways, what I think, right? Because a body of people cast votes, and those things are very limited, of course, by voter suppression, but no vote, like my single vote will not change an election, actually, counter to whatever the, myths people have been fed. So in some ways it can feel really hard to care about voting, but I don't know, Chris, what do you think?
Well, I think, I sort of followed it in that sort of like, I don't, but I feel like the most interesting thing that I try to look for underneath the questions or the perspectives of like to vote or not to vote is about leadership and how people frame leadership or like representation, and thinking of like more like horizontal forms of like what it means to like lead in a space versus the idea of one thing I find interesting is like the idea of like external accountability, that there's something we can do out here to hold another person accountable. And I really want to dig in on that question of like, I still am very sort of like pro leadership. Like, I think there are ways in which we have to formalize our organizing in a way where we have point people in position. But I also don't know if we, and when I say we, I'm thinking of like a Black left for like can sit with that question of what leadership is. And I think it kind of comes back to the idea of governance, right? It comes back to the idea of sovereignty. And and also political education and political development, right? We're dealing with a lot of I mean, I'm in the schools too, so we can see like the ways in which like Black radical history is constantly erased, and every generation feels like they're starting anew. And we don't really we got to recover these same debates like that are in Free the Land to have like real deep conversations about what it means to do this work. So I feel like that history work for me is deeply important for us to really sit in on this question of leadership. Look at Ella Baker, look at the RNA, look at the Malcolm X grassroots movement, and like really, I'm interested in talking about that question more so than I'm interested in talking about the vote.
So it is importantly, you are reminding us also, right, that there are like votes that are not the vote, like that those organizations have electoral processes sometimes, certainly the RNA did, when thinking about like other kinds of voting, other kinds of leadership, representation, etc. Yeah, that's really helpful and really, really beautiful, I think, actually. Sorry, Ed, I think I interrupted you.
Oh, no, not at all. Not at all. You actually gave me time to find what I was looking for and blood in my eye. So I would just, in response to my own question, I definitely feel where both of you are coming from. I personally struggle with that question because very often I feel as though people's individual votes, especially in this type of situation, matter less than we are often led to believe. At the same time, a part of the struggle is with me feeling as though organizing people around electoral politics could be very fruitful, right? Because you mentioned voter suppression, for example, right? So you organize people, they encounter, again, massive efforts to prevent them from either being able to vote in the first place or to make sure that their vote doesn't count. And then what do you offer after that? Okay, so we tried that, not throwing that off the table, but let's continue to think of some other ideas as well. And what I think it could potentially lead to is something that the Malcolm X grassroots movement puts forth, which is people's assemblies, right? There's this structure that's in place that as of right now isn't going anywhere. And so what possibilities are there for organizing people within it until we get to a point where perhaps we can come up with something new? Now, here's why I brought up George Jackson, because he's been yelling at me all month on that question in particular. And I'm looking at, it's pretty early in the text. I'll just read a part of it. He writes, participation in electoral politics organized by the enemy state is the opposite of revolution. And I wrote in the margin this time around, I wonder what Baba Chokwe Lumumba would think of that. Because Chokwe Lumumba, who joined the provisional government of the Republic of New Africa in 1969, and then became the founding chairperson of the New African People's Organization in 1984, before he died, held political office, right? And at the same time, his holding of political office was something that I see in line with some of the original strategy of the New African Independence Movement, which was part of the reason why you moved to some of these majority Black counties in places like Mississippi, is so that you have enough people there to take over some of the elected positions, things like sheriff, right? Which if folks are familiar with the civil rights histories, the sheriff was very important in these various counties because, among other things, the sheriff had the power to determine whether someone's attempt to vote was even legal or not. And then they control the police force, right? So that's a very important position. And so it's a struggle for me. And then, of course, I have to say this. I always remind myself that even in that time, people were struggling for the franchise. And so, if nothing else, my participation at least lets them know that I don't think that their struggles were a waste of time and energy, right? And not to say that I'm not critical of voting or anything like that. I actually, as I said, I struggle with it, and I sometimes lean towards it doesn't matter. But the active participation and the fact that people are trying to putting the full weight of the state in some cases against our ability to vote makes me think that, well, perhaps it at least keeps the people who want to keep us in positions of oppression on edge, right? At least it's just one thing that takes some of their energy away. And of course it takes some of our energy as well, but perhaps it's worth it in the long run. And so I don't want to keep on talking. I know, again, that we have a time limit. So I want to turn things back over to Chris. And before I give up the floor, thank you both. And thank you to Darasia. Thank you to folks who have already hit me up, let me know that you're watching. I really personally appreciate that folks are willing to use this book that I had the honor to write to create this space for conversation.
Amazing. So we do have a number of questions that have come in. I'm gonna start with some of the simple ones. One, my brother Chimoke Efateo. Brother Edward, did I make it in the book?
We'll talk. We'll talk.
Oh man,
that's enough.
Yeah,
that's enough.
So here's the thing. I keep on using the words privilege, honor. It really is a privilege and an honor to do this work, right? I did this work because I was looking for answers. And for me, in order to get the answers, not only do I, as a historian, look to the documents, but I see it as my responsibility, but also a really limited opportunity in some cases to learn from elders, people who are older than me, people who are older than some of the people who I consider to be elders, because they might not consider themselves elders yet. And having that opportunity, I was able to speak with a lot of people, and I only have so much space. and then trying to make sense of everything. It's just intellectual work for those folks who are thinking about doing intellectual work. And something tells me Elias and Chris can both speak to this. It's really challenging. It's really, really challenging. And no matter what, there's no satisfactory conclusion. At least for me, there's still more work to be done. And so the things that I wasn't able to address adequately in this, I and thankfully a number of other people are trying to create space to do more work, more scholarly work that is accessible to our communities, so that we can really bring in as much of the breadth of this movement as possible, and for evaluation from people who are in the streets trying to do the work.
Word. I think one thing that just like resounds for me there is the role of like archives and community held archives. Yeah. And I think, Paul Robeson House and Museum has been deeply interested in, continuing to further that work. And also like a shout out to, Mike Africa Jr. and the MOVE organization, who's also been deeply involved in, documenting their own history and of their own Black revolutionary struggle. So the importance of those archives and how like this documenting the stories and getting the oral histories are deeply important. And it's important we have Black institutions who who understand principles and understand the ethics of doing that work. All right, next question, and this one is I'm gonna weave in two questions together because I think they kind of pull together. One is from Lucy Duncan, and it kind of extends on something that you talked about it because of Chokwe Lumumba and Jackson, Mississippi, and the legacy, and what efforts go forward to build on that legacy. And then also Errol Henderson offered to the YouTube. I'd like the brother's view on the relationship between the RNA's program to Chokwe Lumumba's Jackson Rising program. And I think, there's so much that could be said around like Jackson Rising. I mean, there's an amazing book about Cooperation Jackson as well, a history that people like definitely need to be aware of. So I think, thinking about the extension of this work into like this period of Jackson organizing, if you could talk about that some.
Yeah. I'll tell you, I'll start by saying that I'm not on the ground there, and my knowledge is limited to what I've been able to read in the Jackson Rising text and what I've been able to learn from people who are on the ground. Okay, so I'm not an authority or anything like that. In terms of just thinking about the legacy of Chokwe Lumumba, again, he was the founding chair of the New African People's Organization, and in 1984, and by 1990, New African People's Organization created the Malcolm X grassroots movement, which is a mass association, right, with chapters in various places all over the country. One of the chapters is in Jackson, Mississippi. And so the work that folks are asking about in terms of Cooperation Jackson, the people in that chapter have been involved with that. Again, I can't really go into details because I'm not involved specifically, but it hasn't gone away. If you look at what Chokwe Antar Lumumba has been doing, if you look at the work that Rukia Lumumba, these are both Baba Chokwe's children, they're definitely keeping that legacy alive in some really, I think, interesting and important ways. And they're using the platforms that they have and the spaces that they have access to bring people in and to help organize. And really, at the end of the day, that's what it's all about, right? I asked about voting. More important than vote. I mean, I'm not saying don't vote. In fact, people should vote, right? Let's do it. but we need to organize. We need to organize, and organize some more. And what we do on the ground is what makes, no matter what an outcome of any race is, what we do on the ground is what's going to make meaning, right, out of that particular race, whether it be local, whether it be national. And that's what they're doing. That's what I see them doing. If there's somebody in the YouTube chat who's involved, please feel free to speak up, because the work is dynamic, it's changing regularly, and I just have not had enough contact with the work that's going on there. So definitely I definitely second what Chris said. Pick up that book, Jackson Rising. They give you the ideas that are at the basis of what they're doing. They give you some of the strategy, some of the organizing strategy. They go through talking about their experiences and lessons learned. It's a really powerful book, and it's something that applies not only to Jackson, Mississippi, but that I think people can adapt to wherever their locale is, whether it be rural, whether it be urban, whether it be suburban, whatever it is. There's a lot there that people can learn.
Yeah, I feel like that's such an important point also, that, I mean, I just wanted to foreground that point that you were making, right? That it's like people build on the ground, and that makes possible certain different things of voting, right? I mean, I feel a little bit, sometimes I just get a little glib at this point of the election cycle and voting, where I'm just like, I cannot, I had this conversation for like 3 years.
Well, going down in the comment section, y'all on YouTube.
Well, I think that I think that you're right. I mean, it's like, yeah, I mean, what really matters is the work that's being done on the ground. That's what makes possible the vote to begin with, right? And I'm much more interested in that conversation than I am in talking about who you cast a ballot for. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
All right.
I agree 100%.
I'm gonna throw this short one, and then I got one from Daniel. I got a short one from Amilcar Shabazz, and then I want to go into maybe a longer one from Daniel Tucker. And Amilcar Shabazz, what connections? I think you mentioned this previously. Can you give us more about the connection between Comrade George Jackson and the New African Independence Movement between 1968 and 71, or where? Okay, go ahead.
Oh, I wish he was on this. He could probably give all types of connections.
That's okay.
but here's how I'm gonna approach it. I don't know of anyone who wasn't learning from George Jackson during that period. If they call themselves a revolutionary nationalist in particular, then people were aware of, some people were in contact with either George Jackson himself or people around him, right? And this gets at what Elias was asking earlier about the inside-outside dynamics. By I'm a historian and can never remember dates, but by the mid 70s, so you got to be vague sometimes, imprisoned New Africans created the New African Prisoners Organization. And that was a number of people who were on the inside who were trying to use their position within the belly of the beast to organize for New African liberation and revolution, right? They're putting out all types of important ideas that they're theorizing about the material conditions. They're giving us the framework for Black August resistance that Chris, you read on behalf of Dar-Asia earlier. And on the outside, there are people like Chokwe Lumumba, just to bring him up again, who are organizing for political prisoners and African prisoners of war all over the world, making those connections. And so in 1973, there was the International African Prisoners of War Solidarity Day, and they brought together a number of organizations, the African Liberation Support Committee, African People's Party, Congress of African People, and there's always a whole list of sponsors and co-sponsors, but they brought all of these different forces together to make those connections as clear as possible, to draw attention to incarcerated revolutionaries, to in the US and abroad, right? Everybody from Mandela to Assata Shakur, well, probably not her yet. I think a couple more months before they had captured her. But in my interpretation of all of that, that is one aspect of George Jackson's influence on the movement. And again, I think Dr. Shabazz would be able to give us a much clearer history on some of this, but that's what I see. That's what I've seen happening. And I was able to write about some of it in the text. So yeah, Dr. Shabazz, if you could put in the chat a couple of points that we should look into, I would love to learn more about that.
Well, Dr. Shabazz definitely just gave us a tease. Baba King Yele Umoja is editing a volume on Baba Chokle Lumumba's writings that chart the dialectics of his thoughts and actions vis-a-vis electoral politics. Look for it. So collective wisdom is out there, and let's continue to, get a hold of these works and continue to like archive and support their archiving as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for that.
I'll move to this question. I know we're approaching 2:30 where we wanted to close, but I'll offer this question from Daniel Tucker, and we'll see where we're at, whether we have a space for another one. So Daniel Tucker offers, so I'm curious with the revolutionary Black lens of the Republic of New Africa, if there are lessons for the discussion today of balancing pleasure politics and self-care with movement building.
I love that question. I've actually been having conversations based on a question similar to that one over the last couple of weeks. And so one of the things that Safia Bukhari wrote about, and if people aren't familiar with her, she was a Black Panther in New York. She became a part of the Black Liberation Army. She was captured, became a political prisoner. Actually, for her, it's probably more accurate to say prisoner of war. And when she was incarcerated, and after, she was publishing some of her ideas, really theorizing about the movement, the strengths and weaknesses. Here's what we did right. Here are some lessons learned. One of the most powerful pieces that I've ever read from anybody, right, comes from her. And it's when she talks about PTSD, right? So she talks about how her and her comrades experience post-traumatic stress because they're essentially in a revolutionary war for liberation, and that's traumatic. One of the things that I think many people have learned from that recognition is that sometimes there wasn't the language to really talk about it honestly. Sometimes there weren't, I guess, tools that people had to actually work through the trauma that they experienced. And the language of self-care, essentially what I'm getting at is the language of self-care doesn't really come up until the 70s with some Black feminist organizations, and then it starts to trickle out from there, right? And so I haven't seen, and I would love to know, because I don't know everything, of course, right? I'm still learning. I haven't seen any discussion of self-care or healing, especially in the ways that we've already talked about on this panel, until fairly recently. And so just to answer Daniel's question, I really like the question. I think that if they had the language to discuss it that we have now, I think it would have been in some of the original founding documents, because you can't struggle for liberation if you're hurting all the time, right? And I know some people try. I know some people deny the pain that they feel and the messages their bodies give them, but that's why the language of self-care has become so important recently, because people die from preventable diseases when they don't take care of themselves, calling it sacrifice for the struggle and things of that nature. In terms of the I don't think I can really speak to the pleasure politics. I've heard a lot of varying definitions and explanations of it. some which I think are 100% logical and useful, others that I think are very self-centered, hyper-individualistic, and narcissistic. And so I'd have to have a better understanding for myself, and I'd have to know what angle, Daniel, how you're approaching that concept before I could really have a thoughtful response to that aspect of the question.
Can I pull out one thing you just said, Ed? Because it was really interesting, you know, when you said you can't fight for liberation if you're hurting all the time. Because the flip side of that in the story that you tell, of course, is that you can't fight for liberation without being hurt, right?
Yeah, that's yes, yeah.
So that question that you asked earlier about what does it mean to organize amidst much repression is sort of like, well, that's the name of the game, you know.
Yeah.
And so those two are like intricately intertwined. You have to take care of yourself, as you point out just now in the book, etc. But also there's no outside to the repression. It's there.
Yep. 100. Yes. Where's my 100?
I mean, I like Elias. I know this summer with the Bell Fund, this summer has been pretty intense in terms of like. I wonder, like, how did you all guide the work that you all were doing when it could have been like, you know, I mean, 24/7, you know what I'm saying? And there's so much going on to have a understanding of like care of the folks who are doing. I know it was like a vacation or something that happened. Well, I'll let you tell a little bit about it.
Oh, yeah. You're just trying to throw my whole personal
No.
I'm
sorry, I knew part of the story.
I heard you was on vacation or some shit. Like
what revolution?
Y'all deserve. I said it to say y'all deserve. Y'all were there to take care of folks for a long time, so y'all deserve a space to take a break, right?
Yes.
And so I say that to throw it there and not. But so yeah.
Yeah, I'm playing. No, I mean, I think you know, I mean, I'll say it like on the real, like that Friday night when the George Floyd protest hit and then the curfew went out, I was just bail funding for the next 7 days. You know, I mean, I was having a hard time focusing. I like couldn't sleep, you know, I was just in it, you know. I mean, my body felt all kinds of fucked up, you know. Because you know, just like when you're posting protest bail, it's like you get a call, someone just got arrested, and then you're just checking arraignments for the next like 12 hours, 24 hours. And then when it goes up, you try to post immediately so that they don't get sent from the holding cell that they are to the actual jail up on State Road, because there's then a 14-hour processing period, right? So it's like if you post immediately, you save the person an extra like 24 hours of being in jail, basically. You know? And yeah, I mean, I think what I'll say is that one of the things that I thought in particular while reading Free the Land, and also that I thought about during that period of time was, you know, a lot of people are asking about how to get involved, and it's like, I don't have the time to train you to do anything right now. You know, it's like, actually the time to get involved, you know, is before, you know, or if you're radicalized by that moment, then like the moment things calm down, you got to get in after, right? Because the work of actually building the infrastructure that you need to do the fighting, that work is much more important. And that's a time when you can get people on the inside. And this is also true in Free the Land, right? It's like, if you called up somebody, you know, during the, like, you know, the Bethel raid, and we're like, yo, how can I get involved? It's like, we're getting shot at right now. It's like that, like, there's no, it's too late, you know, I don't have time to train you in anything. You know what I mean? And yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I think that the main thing is just sort of like more people need to be involved earlier and more regularly, because when things are real, it's like, I don't have time to train anybody, you know?
That's one of the things I'm hoping is the outcome of the current moment, right? Typically, at least since I've been aware of these cycles of violence, uprising, cooling off, everybody goes back to normal, right? It seemed to follow a very specific pattern that I started to predict, basically. But things actually feel different this time around. And I'm actually hopeful that more people stay involved, because I do think that, one, partially because of Corona, also partially because of just how younger people are thinking about politics and society, which is different from how I would say my parents' generation thought about it. I just think that more people are open to the idea that something drastically different could become the reality and it could be good for everybody instead of just a few people. So yeah, I'm right there with you. The organizing has to be before and as much as possible during, but after, absolutely after, whenever, if there's ever after, right?
Right.
But yeah, thanks so much for sharing that.
Word. So we're approaching 2:30. I want to give another shout out to Darasia, who supposed to be like experiencing technical difficulties, but is organizer with the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement. They have an amazing concert that is coming up tomorrow. I got to share my screen so y'all could sort of like see it. I just pulled it up on Facebook. The Black August 2020 virtual benefit concert tomorrow, 7 p.m. blackaugusthiphop.com. Features some amazing performers. Dr. Onaci, I know you're also a DJ. You know what I'm saying? So if any of these acts you want to give a shout out to,
all of them.
All of them.
I'm not gonna front. When I saw Sampa the Great, I did get really excited.
Word. International. I want to say from Zambia, then spent time in Australia. Love to see her connected with this movement. So learn more at blackaugusthiphop.com. We'll definitely post that link in the chat as well. Yeah.
Can I just say, folks, if you're just now learning about Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, you can look for Malcolm X Grassroots Movement on Facebook or freetheland.mxgm.org. And if in either space, you can find recordings of all of the webinars, all of the family fitness that we've done throughout the month of Black August. And you can find other stuff from before. So a really good resource to start to learn more about what MXGM's doing all around the country.
Awesome. So I want to begin to close here. I want Elias to talk about his book that he ain't talk about yet.
Well, let's hear that.
Yeah. I have a novel forthcoming from Norton, June of this coming year. I guess that 2021. The title is All the Water I've Seen Is Running. That's it.
Okay. All right.
Oh, I look forward to that.
Word. I'm gonna give you the last word, Dr. Onaci. I'm gonna knock out the Robeson House stuff now. Paul Robeson House and Museum. We got another event this afternoon at 3:30 with Kulu Mele African Dance Ensemble, one of the longest running African dance ensembles in the country. It's a conversation about 50 years, right? And also talk about the like a Pan-Africanism arts and culture here in Philadelphia and how it really became a hub during the 60s and 70s and like what that looks like today too, as we think about like transitions and continuing the work of these organizations. So 50 years of Kulu Mele coming up at 3:30. And then next month, we have a conversation with our conversation series, We Are Each Other's Harvest, which is on September 19th. And September features Cassie Owens of the Enquirer, and also Niela Orr, amazing culture writer who has published a lot, including with The Baffler and The Believer magazine. So be on the lookout for that. You can learn more about the Paul Robeson House at paulrobesonhouse.org. We're also on Facebook under Paul Robeson House Events and also Robeson House PHL, where we've been doing great stuff and collabing with like great orgs like the Claudia Jones School for Political Education. I should have brought that up earlier. There's a deep connection between like the Black communist sort of like black belt thesis but I should have brought that up.
It's in the book.
It's in the book. So that's a tease. That's a tease. Let's talk about that, right? Always got to talk about erased histories, Black communist legacies, and how Paul Robeson is also a part of that. Something that needs to be more well understood. So continue to follow up with us. And Dr. Onaci, what you got going on other than class?
Nothing but appreciation right now. Thank you to the Paul Robeson House, to you, Chris, to you, Elias. I think y'all are all doing phenomenal work. as I said before, it's an honor and a privilege to have written this text. And I always have to thank the people who gave up, you know, significant sometimes amount of time to let me learn from them. And I just, hopefully, you know, I'm just doing all I can to make sure that these ideas circulate, that people can learn from them, and that we can collectively carry on the legacies of our elders who have been in the struggle for so long. So just appreciation.
So appreciate y'all. Thank y'all for, you know, hanging out with us. See y'all in the comments. We'll definitely update it, put all the links in there. Appreciate y'all and catch y'all next time.
Yeah, see y'all later.
Peace.
Thanks.